The son of a billionaire was born deaf, and for 8 years no one was able to help him. Not famous doctors, not luxury hospitals, not millions of dollars. Now comes the part that will outrage you. The cure was not in a laboratory nor in an expensive procedure. It was hidden in the child's ear, and it was discovered by someone no one took seriously. A housekeeper. This story will show you how money failed, how authority was wrong, and how the true miracle came from the hands of someone who cared, not someone who charged. Stay with me until the end because the outcome will make you rethink everything you believe about power, care, and humanity. And if you enjoy real stories that shock, move you, and leave deep lessons, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any of them. Lucian was born in a room too brightly lit for a world he would never hear. The cry everyone expected never came, only a strange, unsettling silence. The doctors exchanged quick glances, the kind that say more than words. Fernando, still anesthetized by the emotion of birth, did not notice the absence of sound. The baby moved, breathed, lived, but did not react to claps or voices. They called his name, slammed doors, tested metallic sounds. Nothing. Lucian remained detached as if behind an invisible pane of glass. There, without any formal announcement, fate began to take shape. And silence became the first character in that story. In the first months, Fernando believed it was just a delay. Every child has their own time, they said, voices that did not yet sound like a threat. Lucian grew handsome, alert eyes, but always quiet. When something fell to the floor, he did not startle. When someone shouted his name, he did not turn his head. His father tried everything: bells, noisy toys, loud music. Lucian only watched, curious but never reacted to sound. Silence stopped being a doubt and became a constant presence. A heavy, uncomfortable presence, impossible to ignore. And Fernando began to fear what no one said out loud. As the years passed, the habit became visible. Lucian touched his ear repeatedly, like someone trying to adjust something out of place. Sometimes he pressed it, sometimes gently pulled, always in silence. His face twisted into small, almost imperceptible grimaces. It was not crying, not complaining, it was something restrained. Fernando watched without understanding why. The doctor said it was common in deaf children. Sensory behavior, they explained with technical coldness, but the father felt there was something wrong beyond the diagnosis. Something no one seemed willing to truly investigate. The first consultation brought difficult words and closed expressions. Tests, charts, devices, lights flashing on cold screens. Lucian stayed still, frightened but obedient. Fernando held his hand tightly as if he could protect him from fate. The result came dry, direct, almost automatic. Profound bilateral deafness. No room for hope, no margin for interpretation. The doctor spoke of limits, adaptation, acceptance. Fernando heard it all, but absorbed only one word: irreversible. Time passed and the reports repeated themselves like empty echoes. New doctors, same answers, speeches increasingly mechanical. Lucian grew up never hearing a laugh, a whisper, a spoken embrace. That he learned to read lips before he even understood feelings. That he learned to observe expressions, to decipher emotions. The world for him was visual, distant, and silent. While other children learned words, he learned to wait. To wait for gestures, to wait for signs, to wait for someone to stop in front of him. Fernando watched everything with a tight heart, and the feeling of helplessness became daily. At 8 years old, silence was no longer new, it was routine. Lucian did not remember a different world, but the habit of touching his ear continued, now with more insistence, more frequency, more discomfort. Sometimes he pressed hard, as if something deeply bothered him. Other times he just touched it, thoughtful, distant. Fernando asked the doctors if it meant anything. They always answered the same way: there's nothing that can be done. And that sentence began to hurt more than any diagnosis. At home, the silence was not only auditory. It was emotional, heavy, almost tangible. Lucian walked through the hallways without making any sound. His steps did not echo, his voice did not exist. Fernando tried to talk, even knowing he would not be heard. He spoke out of habit, out of love, out of desperation. Lucian smiled, not understanding the words, but feeling the intention. It was an incomplete bond, always missing something essential. And the father began to wonder if he had failed as a protector. That doubt followed him every night. The boy observed the world with eyes that were too attentive. He noticed details no one else did, expressions of pity, quick glances, awkward silences. He knew there was something different about him. Even without hearing, he felt separated from the rest. Touching his ear seemed to be his only attempt to communicate with his own body. As if there were something there that did not belong. Something strange, hidden, ignored. But no one seemed willing to look more closely, and that silent neglect prepared the ground for the unexpected. Fernando began to realize the problem was not just deafness. There was something that did not fit the clinical story, the constant discomfort, the grimaces, the repetitive habit. But whenever he insisted, he received technical, cold answers. The authority of the doctors seemed unquestionable. And money, no matter how abundant, did not buy curiosity. Lucian remained trapped in a world without sound. And Fernando began to feel he was fighting alone, without knowing that his search was only beginning, and that the next step would change everything. Fernando Silva never believed that money solved everything. But he had also never encountered something he could not at least try to buy. When he heard the word irreversible, he decided to turn it into a challenge. Not out of pride, but out of love mixed with guilt that he was a billionaire, accustomed to bending systems, markets, and people. Accepting limits was not part of his vocabulary. And accepting that his own son would live in silence was inconceivable. That very week, Fernando began calling the world. Not ordinary doctors but almost sacred names in medicine. If an exception existed, he would find it. Private jets began taking off as if they were routine appointments. United States, Germany, Japan, Switzerland. Luxurious hospitals, silent corridors, rooms filled with technology. Lucian was subjected to increasingly complex tests. Fernando watched everything with absolute attention. Each test was a new hope in disguise. Each pause before the results made his heart race. But the diagnoses always came back the same. Different words, same meaning. Nothing could be done. The specialists spoke carefully but without emotion. They used charts, technical terms, and rehearsed phrases. Cases like this do not respond to stimuli. There is no effective procedure. It is necessary to work on acceptance. Fernando listened, nodded, but inside he rebelled. Acceptance sounded like giving up. And giving up was something he had never done in life. Not in business, not in corporate wars, and certainly not with his own son. Each consultation cost amounts that would terrify anyone. But for Fernando, the real cost was emotional. That he saw Lucian sitting, far too small in enormous chairs. That he saw the boy touching his ear while doctors talked among themselves. They talked about him, but rarely to him. Lucian felt the heavy atmosphere even without hearing words. His eyes searched for his father, asking for silent answers. Fernando squeezed his hand in a mute promise, a promise that he would not give up. Even when the entire world said it was useless. Over time, the doctors began repeating not only diagnoses but expressions. Quick glances, discreet sighs, shorter sentences. Fernando realized when he stopped being hope and became a lost cause. Some specialists began suggesting fewer tests. Others spoke of quality of life, adaptation, limits. Everything sounded like resignation disguised as empathy. Fernando left the rooms with a knot in his chest. Lucian remained in silence, touching his ear. And none of those brilliant minds seemed interested in that detail. Money bought access but not genuine attention. The trips began to grow less frequent. Not for lack of resources but from emotional exhaustion. Fernando already knew the script, the lines, the endings. Each new consultation was a painful repetition. Hope, once vibrant, became cautious. Lucian was already showing fear of clinical environments. Hospitals came to mean discomfort and frustration. The boys stiffened at the sight of white coats. And Fernando felt he was hurting his son while trying to save him. That contradiction consumed him in silence. Even so, he did not stop searching. That he called contacts, foundations, experimental centers. There was always someone who claimed to know someone who might know something. There was always a maybe at the end of the sentence. Fernando clung to those maybes like someone clinging to a thread. But the thread never led anywhere. Lucian remained isolated in his mute world. The father kept spending, insisting, begging. And the sense of failure grew with every refusal. Something inside him began to break. Little by little, Fernando realized he was not fighting only against deafness. That he was fighting a system accustomed to ending stories too early. Against doctors who followed protocols without seeing the individual. Against the idea that money replaced human care. Lucian did not need only tests, that he needed to be seen. But Fernando still believed the solution would come from above, from a title, from a lab coat, from a luxurious room, without imagining that the answer would not arrive by private jet. But from someone who would step into that mansion out of necessity, not status. Lucian's birth was also the day Fernando lost everything. The room still smelled of antiseptic when the silence changed its shape. It was no longer just the absence of sound from the baby. It was the definitive absence of the woman he loved. The doctors moved quickly, tense voices, hurried footsteps. Fernando was pulled away without clear explanations. When he was allowed back in, the room felt far too cold. His wife was no longer breathing, and no fortune in the world could bring her back. that silence would have no cure. Fernando held Lucian in his arms with trembling hands. The baby slept, unaware of the chaos he had caused without meaning to. The father looked at his son and felt love and pain intertwined, that a guilt he could not explain was born in that moment. Part of him wondered if he should have done something differently. Another part wondered if that birth had cost too much, that he would never say it out loud. But the thought hid in the shadows. And it would grow silently, like a slow poison. The house would never be the same. Fernando's grief left no room for screams. Billionaires do not cry in public. They do not fall apart, they do not break, they do not ask for comfort. That he did what he knew how to do best, that he organized everything like a project, that an impeccable funeral, discreet tributes, respectful silence. Inside, everything was in ruins. Outside, nothing could appear out of control. Lucian grew up surrounded by that unspoken absence. And he felt it, even without understanding. His mother's photograph remained in strategic places around the house, that in the hallway, in the office, in the room that was never used. Fernando passed by them every day. Sometimes he stopped, sometimes he looked away. That he never spoke about her to Lucian, that he did not know how to explain someone who could not be heard. The boy watched that woman framed in pictures, that he saw his father change in front of those images. Something heavy lingered in the air, and silence gained more layers. Fernando began to devote himself even more to work. Not out of ambition, but as an escape. Each meeting was a temporary anesthetic. Each financial victory felt like an attempt at compensation. That if he could not save his wife, he would save his son. That became his personal mission, that a form of private redemption. But the effort was charged with desperation. And desperation does not always see clearly. That he confused control with care. Lucian grew up feeling the absence of something he had never known. That he had no memories of his mother, only emptiness. That an emptiness no one explained. The staff avoided the subject. The father avoided eye contact. And the house itself seemed to agree with that silent pact. Nothing was said, nothing was processed. Unshared pain turned into accumulated weight. Lucian learned early that feelings could also be forbidden. Even without hearing a single word. Fernando, on lonely nights, blamed himself in silence. That he wondered if his wife's life could have been spared. That if different choices would have changed that outcome. Guilt did not scream, it whispered. And whispers are harder to silence. Every time he saw Lucian touch his ear, his chest tightened. As if his son carried two losses, his hearing and his mother. Fernando felt he had failed on both fronts, and that feeling haunted him. The mansion began to turn into an elegant mausoleum. Luxury without warmth, space without affection. Lucian grew up inside a house that avoided the past, and Fernando avoided looking deeply at the present. Silence stopped being merely physical. It was emotional, structural, permanent. And the more Fernando tried to compensate with money, the farther he drifted from what was truly missing. Without realizing it, he built a perfect environment to hide pain. An environment where silence would become unbearable. That absence would shape everything that came next. The decisions, the rules, the fears. Lucian was not just a deaf boy. He was the living reminder of a loss never resolved. Fernando tried to protect him from everything. But without realizing it, he also isolated him. The house became too large for small emotions. And the next step would be to turn that silence into a rule that would affect everyone around them. Especially anyone who came too close to Lucian. Fernando's mansion was known as a masterpiece. Impeccable architecture, meticulously maintained gardens, endless corridors. Nothing was out of place. Nothing felt too human. Every room exuded wealth, control, and perfection. But those who passed through its gates felt something strange in the air. It was not just the absence of sound. It was the absence of life. The silence there had weight, and it weighed more than any artwork hanging on the walls. Lucian walked through the corridors like a discreet shadow. His steps did not echo, did not draw attention. Expensive carpets muffled any sound that might exist. Everything seemed designed not to disturb. The boy touched the walls, observed reflections, lights, and paintings. He never ran, never shouted, never played loudly. The house did not seem to allow excess, neither of joy nor of pain. Lucian adapted to that atmosphere without question. It was the only world he knew. Fernando believed that comfort was protection. The safer and more organized the house, the better for his son. Discreet cameras, silent guards, doors always closed. Nothing could get out of control. Nothing could surprise them. That was how he believed he was keeping Lucian safe. But excessive security also creates isolation. And isolation creates emotional distance. Fernando did not realize he was overshielding the boy. The house became both a shield and a prison. The rooms were too large for simple conversations, huge living rooms, long tables, chairs set far apart. Everything created space between people. Lucian always sat at a distance, observing. His father moved quickly, always busy. The staff spoke softly, almost whispering. No one wanted to break the solemn atmosphere of the place. Silence became an unwritten rule, and Lucian learned that their silence was normal. Even when it hurt. Lucian's bedroom was immaculate. Expensive toys, illustrated books, cutting-edge technology. Everything purchased, little used. Nothing there seemed truly chosen by him. Objects filled the space but created no bond. Lucian preferred to sit by the window. He watched the garden, the birds, the staff in the distance. The outside world seemed more alive, more real, more human than the luxury around him. Fernando avoided staying too long in the mansion. When he was there, he isolated himself in his office. It was his silent refuge. There, no one questioned him. No one saw his fragility. Lucian rarely entered that space. There was an invisible distance between father and son. A distance made of unresolved pain. Of unspoken guilt. Of fear of connecting too deeply. The staff quickly understood the unspoken rules. No long conversations with the boy. No unnecessary touch. No emotional closeness. Lucian was to be treated with respect, but from a distance. Fernando never said this explicitly, but everyone felt it was a silent order. And silent orders are the hardest to break. Lucian grew up surrounded by people but profoundly alone. The house seemed to function like a perfect machine. Everything on schedule, everything organized, everything predictable. But emotions do not follow schedules. Lucian felt the urge to play, to express himself. But there was no space for spontaneity. Silence was valued as elegance. And pain was disguised as normalcy. Fernando confused calm with the absence of conflict. Without realizing that the absence of conflict can also mean the absence of visible love. And that shaped the boy day after day. The mansion shone on the outside. On the inside, it accumulated absences. Lucian grew up without noise, without mess, without loud laughter. Fernando believed he was offering the best. But the best is not always the most expensive. Sometimes, it is the simplest. And that truth was still far from being understood, because soon someone would step into that place without fear of silence. Someone who did not understand invisible rules, and who would see what no one else had seen. Inside the mansion, everyone quickly learned how things worked. There was no need for long explanations or formal warnings. It was enough to observe the behavior of the longtime staff. The looks, the restrained gestures, the always quiet tone. Lucian was not treated like an ordinary child. He was treated as something too fragile to be touched. Or too precious to be accessed. The staff knew that any excessive closeness could be costly. Silence was not just respect. It was protection against mistakes. The rules were never written, but they were clear. No games, no prolonged contact. No forming bonds. Lucian was to be watched, accompanied, but not involved. Care without feeling, help without closeness, that was the required balance. Some employees found it strange, others found it cruel, but no one questioned it. Lucian noticed this distance from an early age. The smiles were brief, polite, always cut short. The hands that guided him never lingered too long. His requests, made through simple gestures, were answered efficiently. But without emotional exchange. It was as if he were a valuable object. Something that needed to be preserved intact. Not a child who needed connection. Lucian felt this even without hearing words. The body understands before the mind. The staff were afraid of making mistakes. Afraid of crossing an invisible line. Fernando did not shout, did not threaten. He simply replaced. Those who crossed the line disappeared from the routine, without explanations, without farewells. That history created absolute obedience. No one wanted to be next. And Lucian became the center of distant care. Always watched, never embraced. The housekeeper reinforced the atmosphere with cold efficiency. Everything had to follow strict schedules. Meals, rest, short and controlled outings. Lucian was guided as part of an agenda. There was no room for improvisation. Nor for curiosity. If the boy tried to approach someone, a quick look was enough to end the interaction. Lucian learned to step back. He learned not to insist. Over time, the boy began to observe more than act. He stayed in corners, near walls, near windows. He watched others move without participating. He saw laughter exchanged among adults away from him. He saw conversations happening in visual silence. He knew they were not for him. And even without hearing, he felt excluded. Loneliness does not need sound to exist. It settles in gradually. And becomes a habit. Fernando believed that routine was necessary. In his mind, order meant stability. Stability meant safety. He did not realize he was creating emotional distance. Nor that the staff's fear created coldness. Lucian did not need only routine. He needed real presence. But Fernando confused discipline with care. and no one felt comfortable saying otherwise. The system worked, but the boy was withering inside. The days repeated themselves the same way. Lucian woke up, ate, studied, walked, always accompanied, never connected. Touching his ear became more frequent. Sometimes he stopped in the middle of the hallway and pressed it hard. The staff saw it, but looked away. It was not their job to question medical diagnoses. It was not their job to interpret signs. The habit of ignoring also becomes routine, and no one noticed the risk of that. The entire house seemed to agree with that cold logic. Silence, control, distance. Lucian was cared for like a delicate project. Not like a boy who felt pain. Every gesture of his was observed but not interpreted. Every sign was seen but not questioned. And this prepared the ground for something inevitable. Because when everyone follows rules without feeling, it only takes one person who does not know those rules to change everything. And that person was about to arrive. Bianca arrived at the mansion with no curiosity about the luxury. To her, that enormous gate meant only a chance to pay overdue bills. A chance to keep her grandmother out of a public shelter. A chance to stay on her feet for one more month. There was no dream, no ambition. There was necessity. The simple uniform felt heavy on her tired body. She took a deep breath before going in. She had no idea that place would change her life. Coming from a hard routine, Bianca knew a different kind of silence. The silence of someone who works too much and speaks little. The silence of someone who learns to observe in order not to make mistakes. From the very first day, she noticed the strange atmosphere of the house. Everything was too clean, too organized, too restrained. People spoke little, walked lightly, avoided eye contact. Bianca felt immediate discomfort. It was not fear. It was the feeling that something was unspoken. Something no one talked about. The housekeeper explained the rules in short sentences. Schedules, permitted areas, specific tasks. Nothing beyond the list. Bianca listened carefully. She did not want trouble. She needed that job. But something caught her attention. A warning repeated with extra emphasis. The boy must not be disturbed. The way it was said stayed with her. Bianca had not yet seen Lucian. But the way they spoke about him was different. There was no affection in the words, there was caution. Almost fear. As if he were too fragile or too dangerous. Bianca found it strange. Children are usually mentioned with tenderness. There he was mentioned as a rule, and rules usually hide stories. In the first days, Bianca carried out her duties in silence. She cleaned, organized, followed the flow of the house. She observed everything with discreet attention. She noticed the absence of children's sounds. No laughter, no crying, no calling out. The house seemed to have no child. But at certain hours, something changed. A subtle movement, a silent presence. Bianca sensed that someone passed through there, even without seeing. It was on an ordinary afternoon that she saw him for the first time. Lucian crossed the hallway slowly, alert eyes, light steps, an expression far too serious for his age. Bianca froze for a moment. Not because of an order, but because of the impact. There was something about that boy that did not fit the place. He seemed out of place in his own home. Like someone who did not belong to the surrounding scenery. Bianca felt a strange tightness in her chest. Lucian did not look at her. He passed in silence, lightly touching the wall. Bianca noticed the gesture at his ear. Quick, automatic, almost unconscious. She kept looking even after he had passed. Something there caught her attention. It was not pity. It was recognition. She had seen the gesture before. In people who were in pain and did not know how to explain it. Bianca tried to move on, to focus on her work. But the image of the boy would not leave her mind. That touch on the ear returned like a silent warning. She remembered her grandmother complaining of pains ignored by doctors. She remembered rushed diagnoses. People who were not truly listened to. Bianca felt a conflict arise within her. She did not want to get involved. She could not get involved. But something had already been awakened. She knew that job came with clear boundaries, and she was not there to question anything. But she also knew how to recognize signs. And that gesture was not common. It was not an empty habit. It was a silent plea for help. Bianca would not do anything yet. Not yet. But her eyes had already seen, and when someone truly sees, they can no longer pretend. The next step would be inevitable. Bianca began to observe Lucian more closely, even from a distance. Not out of curiosity but out of instinct. Something about that boy did not fit the story they told about him. Whenever he appeared, the gesture repeated itself. His hand rose to his ear. One quick touch, then another that lingered longer. Sometimes it came with a subtle grimace. Nothing exaggerated. Nothing that would draw attention from someone who was not truly watching. But Bianca was watching. She realized the gesture was not random. It happened at specific moments. After long periods of absolute silence. Or when Lucian stayed still for too long without visual stimulation. Bianca began to associate it with physical discomfort. Not emotional alone. Real pain. The kind that does not know how to ask for help. The kind that hides so as not to bother anyone. She had seen this before. And she recognized it. The other staff members saw the gesture but did not interpret it. Some pretended not to notice. Others thought it was just a nervous habit. No one asked questions. Asking meant crossing an invisible boundary, and no one wanted to be responsible for that. Bianca felt the weight of that collective omission. As if everyone had agreed not to see, she herself tried to ignore it at first. But her body reacted before her mind. Something was wrong. One quiet afternoon, Bianca saw Lucian press his ear hard. This time, the grimace was clearer. His eyes closed for a second. He took a deep breath, like someone enduring something uncomfortable. Bianca stopped what she was doing. The cloth fell from her hand. She knew that was not normal. Not in a child. Not like that. Deafness should not cause constant pain. Of that she was certain. Bianca remembered the medical conversations about Lucian. Always definitive, always closed. Always leaving no room for questioning. But none of those words explained that repeated gesture. That silent suffering. She wondered if anyone had ever stopped to truly observe. Not tests. Not reports. But daily behavior. The body often tells stories that medicine ignores, and Bianca knew how to listen to bodies. She began to observe the schedules. When the gesture appeared more frequently, when Lucian seemed more uncomfortable, she noticed that some days were worse than others. Moments when he became more withdrawn, more isolated, more distant even from his own father. Touching his ear became almost desperate. Yet still silent, Bianca felt a knot form in her stomach that could not be ignored. Bianca tried to mention it discreetly to a more experienced colleague. She received only a quick look and a low warning. Don't get involved. The tone was not cruel. It was fear. Fear of losing the job. Fear of going against unspoken orders. Bianca understood the message, but she could not turn off what she had already noticed. Seeing and pretending not to see required a kind of coldness she did not have. And that was beginning to become a problem. Lucian seemed to notice when someone observed him closely. In one of those moments, he looked directly at Bianca. The look did not ask for anything. It did not beg. It simply acknowledged. As if saying without words, you saw. Bianca felt the impact of that eye contact. It was not imagination. The boy knew she had noticed, and that created a silent bond. An unspoken agreement between two strangers. Something had begun there. Bianca knew she still could not act, not without proof. Not without understanding more, but the detail was too clear to be ignored. The pain was not part of deafness. It was something else. Something physical. Something concrete. Something no one had wanted to investigate, and now that someone had seen it, silence was beginning to lose its strength. Because when a truth begins to reveal itself, it no longer accepts being hidden for long, and the next step would require closeness. Lucian spent long periods alone, even while surrounded by people. He sat near the windows as if searching for movement in the world. He watched the garden, the staff at a distance, the sky changing colors. That was his way of traveling without leaving the place. There were no toys scattered around, no childish mess. Everything was always too neatly arranged. Lucian understood that this was not a place for excess. Neither of joy nor of sadness. He learned to fit himself into silence, and that shaped who he was becoming. His father rarely had time to stay. When he appeared, it was brief, his mind always elsewhere. Lucian watched the movement of his lips, tried to decipher emotions. Fernando smiled, touched his head, but soon stepped away. Not for lack of love, but for not knowing how to deal with that constant pain. His son's presence reminded him of everything he had lost, and that reminder hurt more than the silence. Lucian felt that distance without understanding why, and he began to think it was his fault. The staff carried out their duties efficiently. They brought food, followed routines, ensured safety. But no one stayed. No one sat beside him without a reason. No one asked how he felt. Lucian had no one to share his thoughts with. Even without words, he had feelings, accumulated feelings with no outlet. Loneliness did not scream. It settled in as part of the routine. Lucian began to create his own inner world. He invented stories by watching shadows on the walls. He turned clouds into silent characters. He imagined dialogues he would never hear. He was a creative child, but isolated. Creativity without exchange becomes refuge, and prolonged refuge becomes isolation. He grew used to not being noticed. Not expecting attention. Not asking for anything. Sometimes Lucian stopped in the middle of the hallway. He looked around as if searching for something. Then he touched his ear again. It was not only physical pain. It was a gesture of existential discomfort. Something was wrong inside and outside of him. But no one asked questions. And when no one asks, a child learns to stay silent. Lucian no longer tried to draw attention that he simply existed. Bianca began to notice this pattern. Not only the pain in his ear but the emotional abandonment. She saw the boy always alone during free moments. Never in groups, never in conversations. Always observing from afar. That affected her. Because childhood loneliness carries a different weight that it is silent, but deep. Bianca felt that the child was being forgotten while still alive. And that was more cruel than any illness. One afternoon Bianca saw Lucian drawing alone. The paper was filled with disconnected lines. There were no vibrant colors, no clear figures, only repeated shapes. Circular. Always close to something that resembled an ear. She watched without approaching. But it confirmed something within her. Pain occupied the boy's thoughts, even when no one saw. Lucian lifted his eyes at that moment that he looked at Bianca again. A calm look, but heavy. There was no explicit request. But there was recognition. As if he knew she perceived his loneliness. This kind of connection does not need words. It is a silent agreement between those who suffer and those who see. Bianca felt that she was no longer just an employee. Something connected her to that boy. She tried to convince herself that it was not her problem. That the system existed before she arrived, that she needed the job. But ignoring that loneliness was becoming impossible. The pain in the ear was a physical sign. The loneliness was another, deeper one. And both were being ignored. Bianca was beginning to understand that the greatest problem there was not Lucian's deafness. It was the emotional abandonment surrounding him. And the next step would require breaking an invisible rule. The contact happened without planning, without a conscious decision. It simply happened. Lucian was sitting on the floor of the side room, far from the flow of the house. Bianca was passing by with a cleaning cart when she saw him. The boy slowly spun a small forgotten toy airplane. The wheels squeaked in visual silence that he watched the movement with absolute focus. Bianca slowed her pace. Something about that simple gesture pulled her closer. She knew the rules, she knew she should not approach, but she also knew how to recognize a lonely child. Bianca stopped at a safe distance. She said nothing, she did not gesture, she simply stayed there. Lucian noticed her presence and lifted his eyes. There was a moment of tension. As if both were waiting for an invisible order. It did not come. Bianca crouched down slowly. The movement was careful, respectful. Nothing invasive. Lucian did not pull away. He simply watched. She gently pointed to the airplane. Then she pointed to him. Lucian furrowed his brow, curious. She made a simple gesture as if imitating flight. The boy followed it with his eyes. A small smile appeared. Quick, shy, almost afraid to exist. That smile was a silent earthquake. Bianca felt something break inside her. It was not allowed. But it was too human to ignore. Lucian pushed the airplane toward her. A small gesture, but loaded with meaning. It was an invitation. A test. Bianca hesitated for a second. Then she returned the toy, making the same flying gesture. The boy smiled again, more confident. No words were exchanged. No rule was officially broken. But something had changed. Lucian was no longer invisible in that space. Bianca was no longer just cleaning the floor. They were sharing a moment. An instant outside the rigid control of the house. The boy touched his ear briefly. But this time the gesture was lighter. As if his body were less tense. Bianca noticed it, and her heart tightened. She stood up slowly and moved on with the cart. She did not look back immediately, but she felt Lucian's gaze following every step. It was a new look. Curious. Less empty. Bianca knew she had crossed a line. But she also knew that contact had been necessary. Something simple had produced an immediate effect. That could not be a coincidence. The bond had begun there, without permission, without noise. Lucian spent the rest of the day different. More attentive to the movements of the house. More present. He searched for Bianca with his eyes whenever he could. He did not call out. He did not openly signal. But he waited. Loneliness had been interrupted, even if only for minutes. And when a child tastes connection, they begin to want it again. That was dangerous in that environment. But inevitable. Bianca tried to act normally, but her mind kept returning to the boy's smile. The way he trusted without understanding rules. She knew she could be warned, punished, fired, but she also knew that contact had done him good, and that weighed more than fear. Lucian was not too fragile for connection. He was starved for it, and now there was something between them that could not be undone, something that would grow in silence. The house did not notice what had happened. But the balance had shifted. Lucian was no longer just a distant observer. Bianca was no longer just an invisible employee. There was a thread connecting the two. Thin, discreet, but resilient. And threads like that, when ignored, tend to grow stronger. The next step would not be an isolated gesture. It would be the construction of something bigger. Something no one had ever offered Lucian before. A form of communication that did not depend on sound. After that first contact, nothing was said, but everything was understood. Bianca and Lucian began to recognize each other from a distance. A quick glance in the hallway. A discreet hand gesture. Nothing that would draw attention from anyone who was not paying close attention. It was a silent communication, almost invisible. Lucian began to anticipate her presence. His eyes searched for Bianca even before she appeared, and when she did, something in him settled. As if his body finally relaxed. Bianca realized that Lucian responded better to gestures than to any other kind of stimulus. Not technical gestures, not formal signs. Simple, intuitive, human gestures. A curious point. A raised eyebrow. A hand movement that suggested a question. Lucian observed everything with intense attention. He imitated, tested, adapted. There was no error there. There was attempt. An attempt is the beginning of all language. Little by little, they created small codes. If Bianca lightly touched her chest, it meant calm. If she pointed to her eyes and then to him, it meant attention. Lucian responded with gestures of his own. He indicated when he wanted to be alone. When he wanted to continue the interaction. When something bothered him. It was simple but effective, more effective than any method he had ever received. Because it came without pressure, without expectation, without demand. Lucian began to show himself differently, more present, more curious. Touching his ear still existed, but it decreased at times. Bianca noticed this carefully. She did not comment. She did not celebrate, she simply observed. The boy's body seemed to respond to the bond. As if shared pain weighed less. That reinforced her conviction. The connection was making a difference. They were never together for long. Always a few minutes stolen from the routine. A gesture here. A quick smile there. Enough to create anticipation. Lucian began to smile more often. Small smiles, almost insecure. Like someone testing something new. Bianca felt her heart tighten with each one. That boy had never had space to express joy. Now he was beginning to experience it, even in silence. Bianca had to be extra careful. The housekeeper watched everything. The more experienced staff noticed movements out of the ordinary. Bianca avoided physical contact. Avoided excessive closeness. But the language already existed. It could not be erased. Lucian recognized when she was nearby, and when she was not, he seemed more withdrawn. Emotional dependence was beginning to emerge. And that made everything more delicate. Lucian began to use gestures for something new. To show discomfort. To point to his ear. To express pain more clearly. Bianca understood immediately. Now he did not just feel. He communicated. Even without words. That was huge, because communicated pain demands a response. And Bianca was beginning to feel the weight of that responsibility. She had given Lucian a silent voice. Now she had to decide what to do with it. In one of their brief encounters, Lucian pointed to his ear and made a stronger grimace. Then he looked directly at Bianca. It was not just observation. It was a request. Bianca felt the ground disappear for a moment. That changed everything. Now she was not just someone kind, she was someone he trusted. Someone he turned to, and a child's trust is one of the most serious things that exist. She could not ignore it. But acting meant real risk. The secret language had created a bond too deep to be undone. Lucian was no longer completely alone. Bianca could no longer pretend neutrality. The system of the house remained intact, the rules remained firm. But something had changed beneath the surface. Silence now carried messages, and messages, once created, demand a response. The next obstacle would not be only internal. It would come from someone who did not tolerate deviations. Someone responsible for keeping everything under control, and who was about to realize that something was slipping beyond the rules. The housekeeper did not need to raise her voice to instill fear. Her gaze alone did that efficiently. She watched the house like someone guarding territory. Nothing escaped her for long. Subtle changes were noticed, gestures out of pattern, looks that lingered too long, and Bianca, without realizing it, was beginning to appear in those observations. Not as an explicit mistake, but as a variable out of control. The warning came in an ordinary moment, without witnesses, without dramatization. The housekeeper called Bianca with a short gesture. The hallway was empty, her tone was low, calculated. She said she had noticed an inappropriate closeness. No direct accusations. Just cold observations. Bianca felt her body freeze before she even fully understood. She knew exactly what it was about. The housekeeper explained the rules as if repeating something obvious. Lucian should not form bonds with staff members. It was not healthy. It was not allowed. It was not safe. Each word came loaded with an implicit threat. Bianca tried to respond respectfully. She said she had done nothing beyond what was necessary. The housekeeper did not argue, she simply made it clear that she watched everything. And that consequences would not be negotiated. The final warning was the cruelest. The housekeeper mentioned the history of staff who had been replaced, people who did not adapt to the house's standards. She said Bianca seemed intelligent, that she would understand the seriousness of the situation, and she concluded with a simple sentence that if she continued being close to the boy she would lose her job, and everything that came with it. The threat was not only financial, that it was existential. Bianca felt its weight immediately. When she left that conversation, Bianca was shaking inside. She thought of her grandmother, of the bills, of the overdue rent. She needed that job. There was no support network. There was no plan B. The warning had been far too clear. But at the same time, something hurt even more. The idea of distancing herself from Lucian, of pretending nothing had happened, of returning that boy to absolute silence, that it consumed her. Lucian noticed the change immediately. Bianca avoided eye contact. She moved more quickly through the hallways. She no longer responded to gestures as before. The boy found it strange. His face lost its recent lightness, that he touched his ear more forcefully, more frequently. His body reacted to the absence, as if something that sustained him had been taken away. Bianca saw this from afar and felt her chest tighten. But fear paralyzed her. She tried to convince herself it was for the best, that she could not get involved, that the system existed for a reason, that doctors knew better, that she was exaggerating, but none of those phrases silenced her conscience. She had seen, she had understood, and now pretending ignorance felt like cowardice. The dilemma began to take shape with force. Survive by obeying or act and lose everything. The housekeeper watched with contained satisfaction. Bianca seemed to have understood the message. Order was being restored. Lucian returned to his usual isolation. The house resumed its artificial balance. But something had been broken. The boy's trust, Bianca's conscience. And when this kind of break happens, silence stops being comfortable, that it begins to scream inside. And that scream cannot be ignored for long. Bianca began to lose sleep. She thought about Lucian's look when she turned away. She thought about the pain in his ear. She thought about the clear gesture of request. The housekeeper's warning echoed like a constant threat. But the image of the boy suffering was stronger. She knew she was facing an impossible choice. And impossible choices do not disappear. They demand a decision. The next step would not be small, that it would be a breaking point. And silence was no longer a safe option. Bianca tried to avoid Lucian in the first days after the warning. But avoiding did not mean stopping observing. She saw the boy pass by with a dimmer look, a more rigid body. The gesture at his ear was now more frequent and more intense, that it was no longer just a discreet touch, that it was pressure, that it was visible discomfort. Bianca felt that something was getting worse. And ignoring it was starting to feel like serious negligence. On a quiet morning, Lucian stopped near her unexpectedly. There was no agreed gesture. There was no smile, that he simply pointed to his ear and made a deep grimace. Then he brought his hand to his chest as if asking for help. Bianca felt her heart race. That gesture left no room for doubt, that it was real pain, that it was urgent. She instinctively looked around, no one was watching at that moment. The silence seemed complicit. Bianca crouched down slowly with extreme care. She did not touch him. She only leaned her face closer to observe better. Lucian tilted his head, cooperating. The corridor light hit directly. That was when she saw it. Something dark, dense, that it did not look like part of the body, that it did not look natural. Bianca felt a chill run down her spine. She held her breath so as not to frighten him. That material did not look like ordinary wax, that it was too compact, too thick, too old. Like something that had been there for a very long time. Bianca swallowed hard. That could not be there by chance. And it could not have gone unnoticed by so many doctors. The thought was immediate and disturbing. Someone had failed badly. Lucian watched her face closely, that he noticed the change in her expression, that he noticed the contained shock. His eyes widened slightly. Bianca tried to stay calm. But her body betrayed the shock. She nodded slowly as if to say she had seen it. Lucian brought his hand to his ear again. This time with more force. The pain seemed to increase just by being recognized. Bianca felt an urgency growing inside her. She stood up too quickly and had to restrain herself. She looked around again. The corridor was still empty. The house continued its routine, oblivious to that. Bianca knew she had crossed a point of no return. Now she did not just suspect, she had seen it, and seeing created immediate responsibility. The housekeeper's warning echoed in her mind, but that image was stronger. The dilemma stopped being abstract, that it was concrete and frightening. Bianca spent the rest of the day restless. Each task felt mechanical. Her mind returned to the boy's ear. That dark mass hidden there. She wondered how that had been ignored. How so many exams had not identified something so evident. The explanation was not simple. And that made everything even more serious. Bianca felt she was facing something much bigger. Something that went beyond ordinary medical error. And that terrified her. Lucian in turn was different, more withdrawn, more sensitive. The pain seemed more intense after that moment. Perhaps because now he knew someone had seen it, and when pain is recognized the body reacts. Bianca felt that time was against them. Every hour that passed without action was a risk. But acting meant breaking serious rules, that IT meant challenging an entire system. She had never felt so divided. And the night to come would give her no rest. As she was leaving that day, Bianca stopped before exiting. She looked at the illuminated mansion. Everything looked far too calm for what she carried inside. She knew she would not be able to sleep, because now there was an image etched in her mind. Something dark, dense, hidden in a child's ear. Something that should not be there. Something that explained pain, silence, and suffering. The question was no longer whether she should act. It was how to act without destroying everything, and the answer would begin to take shape in the solitude of the early morning. From a very young age, Lucian associated lab coats with discomfort. That he did not remember voices, but he remembered tense faces. That he remembered bright lights, cold hands, and sudden restraints. Each appointment was a confusing and invasive experience. That he did not understand what was happening. That he only felt his body being controlled, his ear touched without warning, his head held firmly by force. And a pain that came without explanation. The trauma accumulated in silence. Whenever he saw clinical environments, Lucian changed immediately. His body became rigid, his breathing accelerated, his eyes searched for a non-existent exit. Even without hearing, he sensed danger. The smell, the light, the posture of adults. Everything signaled threat. Fernando thought it was normal childhood resistance. The doctors called it expected behavior. But Lucian was not just scared, that he was reliving painful experiences. Each attempt at an exam reinforced the fear. Lucian struggled, cried without sound, pleaded with his eyes. That he was restrained by trained but impersonal hands. Bianca had seen this from a distance on other occasions. She knew that panic was not exaggerated. That it was body memory. The body remembered what the mind could not organize. And the ear, always the ear, was the center of everything. Lucian touched it more forcefully after each appointment. As if trying to expel something that hurt him from the inside. Fernando believed he was doing what was best. That he took his son to more specialists. Subjected Lucian to more tests. But each attempt deepened the trauma. The boy no longer trusted adults in lab coats. Nor white rooms. Nor necessary procedures. Everything was invasion. Everything was threat. And no one seemed to realize they were making things worse. The focus was on the diagnosis, not the child. Bianca now understood why Lucian panicked at the mere thought of a hospital. It was not irrational fear. It was protection. That he had learned that doctors meant pain. That procedures brought no relief. Only repeated suffering. The discovery in his ear explained everything. Each medical touch had pressed on something that should not have been there. Each exam had caused real pain. And no one had stopped to ask why. Lucian did not trust because he had never been heard. Neither literally nor humanly. After the discovery, Bianca noticed that his fear increased. Not only because the pain had worsened, but because now there was expectation that he knew someone had seen it. And he feared that meant more doctors. More white rooms, more restraint. Lucian avoided any gesture that resembled exams. That he recoiled at the slightest sign of adult approach. His body screamed for protection, and Bianca felt the weight of that. Helping could not mean traumatizing him even more. She found herself trapped in a cruel impasse. Taking Lucian to a hospital could save him. Or it could break him completely. The trauma was too deep to ignore. Lucian would not endure more invasive procedures. Not without trust. Not without emotional safety. Bianca realized the traditional solution would not work. Something needed to be different. Something needed to respect the boy's fear. But that required a decision outside any protocol. And that decision was getting closer. That night, Bianca understood that time was running out, the pain was increasing, the trauma limited the options. And the house's system would never allow improvisation. She wondered if there was a safe way out. A way to help without emotionally destroying Lucian. Without drawing immediate attention. Without provoking a violent reaction from the adults. The answer was not clear. But one thing was certain. Taking Lucian to more doctors was not the solution. And the next step would require absolute courage. Bianca began to walk through the mansion like someone carrying a secret that was far too heavy. Each step seemed to echo inside her. Lucian's ear, that dark image, returned to her mind constantly. She tried to focus on her tasks, but her body would not obey. Her hands trembled discreetly, Her eyes searched for the boy even when she forced herself to avoid him. The housekeeper's warning was still alive, clear, objective, leaving no room for dialogue. Obedience meant keeping her job. Disobedience meant losing everything. Bianca thought about her grandmother constantly, about the simple bed, the ration medication, the fear of abandonment. That salary was not luxury, that it was survival, that it was minimal dignity. She knew what happened when money ran out, she had lived it before, and the idea of returning to that reality paralyzed her. The system of the house was unjust, but it kept her standing. Obedience seemed like the logical path. But logic is not always human. At the same time, every time she saw Lucian touch his ear, something broke inside her. That it was not just empathy, that it was responsibility. She had seen something no one else had. Ignoring it would mean choosing her own comfort over a child's pain. Bianca wondered if she could sleep knowing that if she could look at herself in the mirror. The silence of the house was beginning to suffocate her. Because now she understood what that silence hid, and understanding changes everything. After it there is no return to ignorance. She tried to rationalize. Maybe she was exaggerating. Maybe it was not that serious. Maybe doctors really did know better. But those excuses fell apart quickly. Lucian's pain was visible, concrete, recurring, and no medical explanation justified constant suffering. Bianca knew she was not a specialist. But she also knew how to recognize neglect when she saw it, and this had the smell of long-standing neglect. The fear of the housekeeper returned like a shadow. Bianca remembered the controlled tone, the calculated words. That woman would not hesitate to destroy her professionally. She would lose her job, her income, perhaps even future references. In a harsh world, that meant falling without a safety net. Bianca felt anger at that structure, a system that demanded obedience above compassion, that protected rules, not people. Lucian was the greatest victim of all this. And Bianca was caught in the middle of the conflict. The nights became far too long. Bianca lay down, but sleep would not come. She imagined Lucian waking up in pain, alone, without knowing how to ask for help. The gesture at his ear became a silent scream in her mind. She thought about how many times someone had chosen not to get involved, how many opportunities had been lost, and now that responsibility had landed in her hands, not because she wanted it, but because she had seen, and seeing creates obligation. Bianca began to ask herself what was truly right. To obey unjust orders or to protect a vulnerable child. To maintain her own stability or to risk everything for someone defenseless. There was no easy answer. Any choice would have consequences. But one of them would allow the suffering to continue, the other at least offered a chance for change. Bianca felt she was being tested. Not by the house, nor by the housekeeper, but by her own conscience. And conscience cannot be silenced by a paycheck. She understood at that point that there was no middle ground, there was no pretending she had not seen, there was no waiting any longer. Every day of waiting meant more pain for Lucian, and more guilt for her. The decision had not yet been made, but the path was beginning to take shape. Not as a rational plan, but as an inevitable moral impulse. Something inside her said that surviving without acting would be a kind of silent death. And the following dawn would be decisive. Dawn arrived without bringing rest. Bianca remained awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring into nothingness. The silence of the room felt heavier than the silence of the mansion. She replayed every gesture of Lucian, every grimace of pain. The image of the ear would not leave her. Something dark, out of place, ignored for years. Bianca felt that time was running against them, not in days but in hours. There was an urgency that allowed no more delays. And that night demanded a definitive choice. She thought about every possible consequence. Immediate dismissal, humiliation, the police being called. She thought about her grandmother, the real fear of losing everything. But she also thought about Lucian waking up in pain again, alone, without understanding what was hurting him, without knowing how to ask for help. Bianca realized something harsh in that moment, that if nothing were done, she would become complicit in the suffering. And that would be a guilt impossible to carry. Bianca knelt beside the bed, not out of rigid religious habit, but out of human necessity. She did not ask for courage to feel no fear, she asked for courage to act despite it. She asked for clarity so she would not make mistakes. She asked for protection for that boy. It was a simple prayer, almost desperate. When she stood up, something had changed. The fear was still there, but it no longer commanded her decisions. She spent the rest of the night thinking about how to act. She could not call doctors, she could not alert the housekeeper. Any official move would destroy everything. The decision had to be silent, discreet, fast. Bianca remembered basic care, simple situations. She knew she was not dealing with something too deep. It was visible, accessible. and every minute seemed to increase the risk of infection and pain. When the sky began to lighten, Bianca did not feel sleepy, she felt determined. She looked at herself in the mirror and recognized her own face. There was no heroism there. There was responsibility. She knew she could make a mistake, that she could be severely punished. But she also knew that not acting would be an equally serious choice. The decision was made, she would help Lucian, even if it cost her everything. Bianca arrived at the mansion earlier than usual. The environment was still asleep. Few staff members were moving around. It was the safest moment. She took deep breaths with every step, her heart raced, but her focus remained. There was no room for hesitation now. She needed to find Lucian in an isolated moment, without witnesses, without interruptions. The plan was not yet fully formed, but the intention was clear. When she spotted Lucian early that morning, Bianca felt a knot in her throat. The boy looked tired, paler. The gesture at his ear came almost immediately. That confirmed everything. She approached carefully. Lucian recognized her and did not retreat. There was trust in his eyes, an absolute and dangerous trust. Bianca felt the weight of that. Now she was not deciding only for herself, she was deciding for him. Bianca made a simple gesture, asking for calm. Lucian obeyed. That frightened her more than any external threat. That boy trusted her without reservation, and trust like that allows no mistakes. She felt the ground disappear beneath her feet, but there was no turning back. The decision made at dawn now had to become action, and the next step would allow no room for regret, because the pain was about to explode. The crisis began abruptly, without warning. Lucian stopped in the middle of the hallway as if his body had failed. His hand went straight to his ear, now with no gentleness at all. His fingers pressed hard, almost in desperation. His face contorted into an expression Bianca had never seen before. It was not just discomfort, it was searing pain. Lucian lost his balance and dropped to his knees on the cold floor. The silence of the house was broken by a soundless cry. Thick tears streamed down without any noise. Bianca ran to him, forgetting all the rules for a moment. She knelt beside him, her heart pounding. Lucian was trembling, his entire body reacted as if it were being attacked from the inside. He pulled at his own ear, desperate, trying to relieve something unbearable. Bianca felt panic rise in her throat. There was no more time for reflection. There was no more room to wait. This was no longer a chronic discomfort. It was a real, immediate, dangerous crisis. Lucian fell onto his side, curling in on himself as if trying to escape his own pain. The tears continued, silent but abundant. His face pleaded for relief. Bianca tried to calm him with familiar gestures. She placed her hand on her chest, signaling calm. But the boy could barely focus. The pain was too great. The gesture at his ear became almost aggressive. Bianca feared he would hurt himself even more. The situation was completely out of control. She looked around, seized by a primal fear that if someone appeared, everything would end right there. But in that moment, it no longer mattered. Lucian was suffering too much. Bianca gently held his hands to prevent him from injuring himself. The boy did not resist. He only cried, exhausted, surrendered. That surrender broke her heart. It was the definitive proof that he could not endure anymore. And also the clearest sign that acting was inevitable. Bianca realized the pain seemed to pulse in waves. Lucian breathed rapidly, then held his breath. His small body arched with tension. She felt an overwhelming responsibility. That child was trusting his life to her in that instant. There was no manual, there was no authorization. There was only urgency. Bianca remembered what she had seen in his ear. Something that did not belong there. Something that needed to come out. Fear tried to paralyze her again. What if she made a mistake? What if she caused something irreversible? But looking at Lucian in that state made any doubt cruel. Not acting now would be abandonment. Bianca took a deep breath, trying to steady her own hands. She needed to be calm for both of them. Lucian began to lose strength, exhausted from crying. His body relaxed in a dangerous way. This could not continue. Bianca gently tilted the boy's face with extreme care. Lucian did not react. He was surrendered to the pain. She felt the full weight of the decision she had made at dawn. This was the moment of no return, the point where all reflection turned into action. She knew that whatever she did next would change everything, for better or for worse. The silence of the house seemed to be watching, and the next move would define the fate of them both. Bianca felt time compress around her. Everything seemed to happen too fast and too slowly at the same time. Lucian was weak, his body warm, his face wet with tears. She knew she could not take him anywhere in that state. Every second of waiting seemed to amplify the pain. Bianca took a deep breath and sought control in her own hands. There was no room for panic now. She needed to be firm, precise, careful. Any mistake would be irreversible. But not acting would be even worse. She guided Lucian to a more secluded corner, away from circulation. She knelt again, keeping the boy supported in her lap. Lucian did not resist, he simply trusted. That gesture of trust went straight through her. Bianca asked for calm with the familiar gesture. The boy tried to obey, even while trembling she gently tilted his head, the light fell directly into the ear, and there it was again, dark, compact, out of place. The final confirmation that left no doubt. Bianca felt her hands sweat, her heart was beating too hard. She was not a doctor, she had no instruments, she had no permission, she had only the certainty that it needed to come out. She used what she had available with extreme care. Slow movements, almost imperceptible. Lucian tensed his body at the first contact. Bianca stopped immediately, searching for his eyes. She asked for trust, and he trusted. The next moment seemed to last an eternity. Bianca advanced with controlled precision. No force. No haste. The material did not move easily. It was old, resistant. Each small advance required absolute concentration. Lucian breathed shallowly but did not struggle. The tears continued, silent. Bianca felt that any distraction could be fatal. The house around them seemed non-existent. There was only that act. When the blockage finally began to give way, Bianca felt a physical shock. Something was coming loose. Something that should never have remained there. She slowly removed the dark, dense, frightening material. It was larger than she had imagined. Bianca could hardly believe what she was seeing. Lucian shuddered one last time. Then his body relaxed, the expression of pain began to fade. The silence felt different. As if something had been broken forever. Bianca held the object with trembling hands. Relief came mixed with terror. She had done it. There was no turning back. That if someone walked in at that moment, everything would be lost. She looked at Lucian, searching for signs. The boy was breathing better. Deeper. Less tense. His eyes began to move differently. As if they were searching for something new in the environment. Bianca felt a chill run down her spine. Something was about to happen. She tried to gently clean the ear with extreme care. Lucian did not protest. He did not flinch. He did not cry. On the contrary, he seemed intensely attentive. Bianca felt her legs weaken. She did not know if she had saved that boy or ruined her own life. The housekeeper, Fernando, the police. All of that would come later. Right now, only one thing mattered. What Lucian was about to experience for the first time. And the next instant would change the story forever. The silence that followed was not like the others. It was a suspended silence, heavy with expectation. Lucian remained still for a few seconds, his eyes too wide. Bianca felt her heart pounding in her ears. The boy seemed confused, as if something invisible had shifted inside him. He blinked slowly, took a deep breath, and then something almost imperceptible happened. Lucian turned his head in the wrong direction. Not looking for someone, but responding to something. Bianca did not move, did not breathe properly. The environment seemed to vibrate in a strange way. The old clock in the room marked time steadily. Lucian frowned, his eyes widened. He brought a hand to his chest, as if feeling his own heart out of rhythm. The sound of the ticking echoed clearly now. A simple, repetitive tick-tock. Something that had always existed, but had never reached him. Lucian was hearing. His body reacted before his mind. A slight jolt ran through his shoulders. He looked around like someone waking up in another world. His lips parted without any sound. Then they trembled. Bianca felt her legs give way. She held onto the wall to keep from falling. The clock kept marking time, and each second felt like a revelation. Lucian was receiving stimuli too new to process. But there was no pain. He brought his hand to his ear, now carefully. There was no grimace. No tension. Only absolute curiosity. Lucian tilted his head again, the ticking continued, and then something even more impossible happened. He smiled. A wide smile, without fear. Bianca felt tears flood her eyes. That was not just relief. It was discovery. It was the world opening up. Lucian took a small step forward, then another. His eyes searched for the source of the sounds. The fabric of Bianca's dress brushed lightly as he moved. Lucian froze, looked at her, touched his own ear, then touched her arm. The simple friction produced a barely perceptible sound. But for him it was thunder. Lucian stepped back, startled, then laughed. He laughed without sound, but with his whole body. It was his first encounter with the audible. Bianca could no longer contain herself. She knelt in front of him, tears streaming freely. She pointed to the clock, then to his ear. Lucian followed everything with shining eyes. He was trying to understand this new code of the world. Everything vibrated. Everything had presence. Absolute silence was over. Bianca felt joy mixed with panic, because that miracle had no witnesses. And solitary miracles often bring harsh consequences. Lucian took a deep breath and tried to repeat the gesture he had learned by watching mouths for years. His lips moved with effort. The air came out unevenly. Bianca noticed the effort. The boy tried again, And then, almost like an imperfect whisper, a word was born, short, broken, but real. Dad. Bianca felt the world stop. That sound was not just a word, that it was an emotional earthquake. Lucian did not yet know the weight of what he had said, but Bianca did. Fernando was in the house. That word changed everything. She felt a chill run through her body. The miracle had happened. But now it needed to be explained, and no one would easily believe the person who caused it. The next moment would not be one of celebration, that it would be one of shock. And someone was about to walk into that scene without understanding anything. Fernando entered the room without haste, still trapped in distant thoughts. But something stopped him before he even realized it, that a word echoed through the air. Not only in Lucian's ears, that his Fernando froze as if the ground had vanished beneath him. His entire body stiffened, that he knew that word, that voice. Even fragile, even imperfect, that it was impossible to mistake it. Lucian had spoken. Fernando's heart raced out of control, that he took a few quick steps forward, almost stumbling. His eyes searched for impossible explanations. Lucian was standing, alert, different. There was something new in his posture. Something alive. Something Fernando had never seen before. Before he could ask anything, his gaze fell on Bianca. She was kneeling, hands trembling, tears on her face. And then he saw the blood, that a small detail, but enough to trigger panic. Fernando reacted like a man accustomed to control, that he did not ask, that he did not listen, that he did not think, that he shouted for help. Called security. The word police left his mouth like an automatic command. To him, there was only one possible interpretation. Someone had touched his son without authorization. Someone had crossed every boundary. The miracle was swallowed by fear. Shock erased any rational thought. Fernando saw Bianca not as a savior, but as an immediate threat. Bianca tried to explain with quick gestures. She pointed to Lucian's ear, showed what she had removed. Her hands shook so much she almost dropped it. Fernando barely looked. His mind was fixed on the risk, on the blood, on the idea of loss. The word doctors hammered in his head, that he shouted for authorities while Lucian watched everything in confusion. The boy felt the tension without understanding. The space that seconds before had been discovery was now chaos. Lucian tried to move closer to his father. He called out again with effort. Dad. The word came out clearer this time. Fernando froze for a second. The sound pierced his emotional armor. But fear still spoke louder. He looked at his son, then at Bianca. The inner confusion was visible. Something impossible had happened. But the scene felt too wrong to be accepted without official explanations. Fernando needed external validation. And the police symbolized that. The housekeeper appeared, drawn by the commotion. Her gaze went straight to Bianca. There was no surprise. There was confirmation. She discreetly nodded to Fernando, as if to say the mistake had been foreseen. That gesture sealed Bianca's fate in that instant. Fernando interpreted it as proof of transgression. The decision was made, the police were already on their way, and Bianca felt the weight of it fall onto her shoulders. She did not resist, she did not run, she simply remained there. Lucian sensed something change in the air. Fear returned to his body, but now there was a new sound mixed into the chaos. The loud voices, the fast footsteps, the security radios. Everything reached his ears without a filter. It was too much to process. He curled in on himself slightly, confused. Bianca tried to calm him with the hand-to-chest gesture. Fernando saw that and felt a sudden surge of anger. In that moment, he believed Bianca had crossed every possible boundary, even without fully understanding what he had just witnessed. The sirens began to approach. The sound cut through the mansion like a sentence. Lucian reacted with a start, bringing his hand to his ear. But this time it was not pain. It was sensory overload. Fernando saw this and felt the ground waver. Something was wrong with his own reaction. His son was reacting to sound that made no sense within everything he believed he knew. But the structure of control still guided his actions. He needed someone to tell him what to think. And now the truth was about to collide with everything he had built. The arrival of the police brought a different kind of silence to the mansion. A silence of tension, expectation, and fear. Bianca was gently escorted aside, without handcuffs, but without a voice. Fernando paced back and forth, trying to organize thoughts that refused to fit together. Lucian sat nearby, his eyes far too alert, reacting to every new sound: the officer's footsteps, the click of the radio, the rustle of papers. Everything reached him like a sensory avalanche. Fernando watched it all with growing disbelief. Something did not align with 8 years of definitive diagnoses. One of the officers asked to see what had been removed from the ear. Bianca showed it with trembling hands. The dark object was placed on a white cloth. The contrast shocked everyone. It was not small. It was not recent. It was not something that could have gone unnoticed easily. One of the officers, a former nurse, frowned he said quietly that it did not look like ordinary earwax. Fernando felt his stomach turn. Doubt began to crack the armor of certainty. Fernando demanded a doctor be brought in immediately. This time not a distant specialist, but someone who would truly look. The professional examined Lucian with extreme care. No restraint. No force. No rush. Lucian remained calm, attentive to the sounds around him. The doctor confirmed the unthinkable. The auditory canal had been obstructed for years. The deafness was not neurological. It was physical. And reversible. The silence that followed was devastating. Fernando felt his legs give way. 8 years. 8 years of suffering. 8 years of misdirected guilt. 8 years of doctors paid their weight in gold who never truly looked. The truth fell like a blunt blow. The miracle had not come from technology, nor from money. It had come from human attention that refused to ignore. Fernando approached Bianca slowly. For the first time without anger in his eyes. He dropped to his knees in front of her, not as a billionaire, but as a broken father. He asked for forgiveness without beautiful words, without excuses. He asked forgiveness for not seeing, for not listening, for trusting systems too much and people too little. Bianca cried, unable to respond. Lucian watched everything, now understanding sounds and emotions at the same time. He walked toward his father, touched his shoulder, and repeated more clearly, "Dad." Fernando embraced his son as he never had before, without fear of breaking rules, without emotional distance. The sound of Lucian's cry, still imperfect, crossed the room. It was a new sound, raw, real, and absolutely alive. The housekeeper watched from a distance, motionless, her certainties collapsed in silence. The police closed the case right there. There was no crime. There was accumulated negligence and a single act of courage. The story did not end in applause. It ended in awareness. Fernando understood, too late, that money buys access, not care. That titles do not replace attention. That protocols do not save when the gaze is absent. The miracle did not come from the most expensive hands. It came from the hands that cared, from the hands that dared to see. Lucian did not gain only his hearing that day. He gained voice, presence, and connection. And Fernando gained something he could never buy, humility. How many times is the truth right in front of our eyes, and yet we choose not to see it? How many pains are ignored because they come from those without titles, status, or a voice? This story is not just about a boy who learned to hear again. It is about a system that stopped listening. About how attentive love can save more than any fortune ever could. If Bianca had obeyed in silence, Lucian might never have heard a single word. And you? Would you have the courage to act when everyone tells you to stay quiet? Leave a comment and tell us what this story awakened in you. Would you have done the same in her place? If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications and stay with us, because sometimes the greatest change begins when someone decides to see what everyone else ignores.